They were standing in the dirt, a mother and her 6 children, being auctioned off like livestock for $15. People watched. Some turned away. No one stepped forward, except one man. Ezra Blackwood didn't plan to be a hero that day, but when he saw their faces, he spent the last coin he had and bought a family he didn't even know he needed. If you believe one impossible choice can change a lifetime, stay with us. The sound of metal scraping against metal broke the dawn like a wound opening in the earth. Ezra Blackwood stirred where he lay curled in his bedroll near the edge of the Milbrook rail depot, his hand instinctively closing around the cold handle of the Colt resting at his side. For a few heartbeats, his breath stayed shallow, his body still. Only when he opened his eyes did he realize it was just the wind, dragging an empty tin can across the gravel, like some forgotten relic trying to find a voice. He sat up slow, joints stiff from too many nights sleeping on hard ground, and watched the Nebraska plains wake under a sky the color of tarnished silver. The air smelled of coal smoke and distant rain. A train was due in an hour, the first of the week, and already a handful of people drifted near the platform. Merchants, drifters, a couple with worn satchels, their faces pinched and tired. Ezra pulled on his coat, dusted off his hat, and stood, shaking the chill from his bones. 3 days' ride had brought him here, though for what purpose he couldn't say. His life, for months now, had been a slow drift from one tired town to another, taking odd jobs, fixing fences that weren't his, sleeping beneath skies too wide for a man with no place to belong. His horse, Dusty, gave a low snort from where she was tied to the post, as if sensing her rider's unsettled mind. Ezra crossed to her, running a hand along her neck, grounding himself in her familiar warmth. "You and me both, girl," he murmured. A few yards away, 2 boys no older than 10 darted between freight crates, chasing each other with thin, hungry laughter. Their faces were hollow, their clothes too small. Ezra watched them for a moment, then looked away. Hunger and desperation weren't strangers in towns like this. He'd just stepped toward the general store when a sharp voice cracked through the air, cutting, frantic, edged with something that turned his stomach cold. $15, 15 for the lot of them. Ezra froze. The voice belonged to a man standing atop a crate near the depot platform, wild-eyed and shaking, waving his arms like a deranged auctioneer. Beside him stood a woman and 6 children, all lined up in the dirt like livestock waiting for market. The woman's dress hung loose on her thin frame, her hair falling loose from its pins. Her eyes, God help him, her eyes, were vacant, like glass left too long in the sun. The smallest child, no more than 3, clung to her skirts. The oldest, a boy maybe 15, stood with fists clenched at his sides, like he wanted to swing at the world but didn't know where to start. Ezra's throat tightened. This wasn't right. This wasn't the kind of wrong a man could walk past and forget. His feet moved before his mind could catch them. The tin can kept rolling, untouched, across the gravel. Ezra pushed through the loose circle of bystanders, each step heavy, deliberate. A few folks had gathered, though none stepped forward. Some watched with dull curiosity, others with shame in their eyes, but all of them kept their distance, as if proximity to this moment would stain them. The man on the crate, Frank Whitaker, someone muttered, wobbled on unsteady legs, hair matted with sweat, eyes bloodshot and wild. His coat hung open, revealing a pistol jammed awkwardly into his waistband. He smelled like whiskey and old fear. Ezra could see it clinging to him, thick as dirt after a storm. $15, Frank shouted again, his voice cracking now, unraveling. "That's it. You'll get the wife and the brats. Take 'em off my hands, no questions. Just pay me and be done." The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling like uneasy wind through dry grass. No one reached for a pocketbook. No one moved toward him. Mary Whitaker stood silent at the center of it all, her hands resting on the shoulders of the 2 youngest children, her body drawn tight like a tree bracing against a gale. Her face held no anger, no tears, just a kind of hollow resignation, as if this moment was simply the next cruel turn in a long line of disappointments. Ezra's jaw clenched, his mind scrambled for logic, for some explanation. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe the man was bluffing, trying to make a scene, force sympathy. But when Ezra looked at Mary, really looked, he saw the truth. This wasn't performance. This was surrender. Ezra stepped forward, boots crunching in the gravel. Frank saw him, and for the briefest second, relief flickered across his sunken face. "You buying?" Frank asked, voice dropping to something close to hope. $15, friend. That's all I need. Just 15. Ezra's fingers brushed the coins in his coat pocket. Wages from a fence-mending job 3 towns back. Not much more than what the man was asking. Enough for supplies and feed for Dusty, maybe a few nights' shelter. Certainly not enough for this. But the alternative? Ezra exhaled, slow and hard. With movement steady and sure, he reached into his pocket, pulled out every last coin he had, and without a word, stepped forward to drop them at Frank's feet. The sound of silver on wood rang sharp and final. The crowd gasped. Frank blinked as if he hadn't believed anyone would call his bluff. But greed won out over doubt. He bent fast, scooping the money with trembling hands. "It's done then," Frank rasped, already stumbling toward the depot office, clutching the coins like they might vanish. Ezra stood alone now, facing Mary and the 6 pairs of frightened eyes behind her. Silence stretched between them. Thick, unreadable. Ezra cleared his throat, searching for words that didn't exist. "Ma'am," he managed at last, his voice rough from disuse. Mary didn't answer. Her gaze stayed fixed on the dirt between them. Behind her, one of the younger girls started to cry. Soft, confused, afraid. Ezra shifted his weight, feeling the impossible weight of what he'd just done settle heavy on his shoulders. Let's get you folks out of here," he said finally, motioning toward where Dusty stood waiting. No one moved at first. Then, slowly, like survivors stepping from wreckage, Mary gathered her children and followed. The road out of Milbrook stretched wide and empty, a long ribbon of dust cutting through miles of prairie. The sun hung low, casting copper light across the fields, turning every blade of grass into a line of fire. Ezra rode ahead on Dusty, glancing back now and then to make sure they were still following. Mary walked at the front of the group, her children trailing close behind like shadows too scared to break formation. The oldest boy, tall, lean, maybe 15, kept pace at her side, stealing wary glances at Ezra every few steps, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. The smaller ones clung to each other, their hands full of whatever meager belongings they'd carried from the depot. A threadbare blanket, a cracked tin cup, one small doll missing an eye. Ezra hadn't asked their names. Not yet. He didn't know how to. The air between them felt fragile, like glass stretched thin by heat. One wrong word, and it would all shatter. They reached his cabin just before sundown. It sat low on a gentle rise, nothing more than a single room with a rusted tin roof and a small stone chimney, already darkened from too many lonely winters. The front door hung a little crooked on its hinges, and the steps leading up to it creaked like old bones. Ezra dismounted and tied Dusty to the post out front. The family stayed back at the gate, uncertain, like stray dogs called too close to a hand they didn't trust. Ezra scratched the back of his neck, then moved to unlatch the door. "It ain't much," he said over his shoulder, "but it's dry, and warm enough once the fire's going." Mary didn't respond, but she gave the slightest nod, an exhausted tilt of her head, as she ushered her children toward the porch. Inside, Ezra worked quickly. He lit the lantern, then set about building a fire in the hearth. The room filled with the smell of wood smoke and old cedar. There wasn't enough bedding for everyone, just his own narrow cot and a moth-eaten blanket folded near the wall, but he pulled everything he had into the center of the room. The children gathered close to the warmth, sitting cross-legged, their eyes wide and quiet. The little one with the doll climbed onto her mother's lap, burying her face in Mary's shawl. Ezra stood back, hands on his hips, unsure what to do next. He wasn't a man used to company, let alone this kind of company. Mary finally broke the silence. "Why?" Her voice was soft, hoarse, like she hadn't used it in days. Ezra blinked, caught off guard. "Why what?" he asked. "Why did you do it?" Ezra let out a long, slow breath. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since the depot. The lines on her face told stories she hadn't spoken. Grief, fear, years of endurance packed tight beneath tired eyes. "I don't rightly know," he said at last, voice low almost to himself. "Just couldn't stand there and let it happen." Mary lowered her gaze to the fire. One by one, her children leaned against her, seeking warmth and comfort she barely had the strength to give. Ezra turned away, giving them space, but his chest ached with something unfamiliar. Something like belonging. That first night passed like a slow-moving storm, quiet on the surface but charged underneath. Ezra lay awake long after the fire burned low, staring at the shadows shifting across the ceiling. The cabin, once filled with nothing but his own silence, now breathed with soft, restless sounds. The whimper of a child caught in a bad dream, the creak of floorboards as Mary shifted position to comfort one or another of them, the faint crackle of dying embers. He turned toward the wall, willing himself to sleep, but it wouldn't come. When morning broke, it did so without ceremony. Pale gray light seeped through the warped slats of the window. Ezra rose before the others, pulling on his boots and stepping outside. The air smelled of wet earth and distant rain, and for a moment, he just stood there, hands tucked in his coat pockets, staring out over the fields that stretched all the way to nowhere. By the time he came back in, Mary was awake. She sat cross-legged near the hearth, her hair hastily braided, her dress still wrinkled from sleep. The older boy stood near the door, eyes wary, arms crossed like a sentry. The other children remained curled together, slow to stir. Ezra cleared his throat. "I'll get water from the creek," he said, reaching for the bucket by the door. "Then I'll see what I can do about breakfast." Mary didn't answer, but her gaze softened just enough to register the offer. By midday, the cabin smelled of coffee and cornmeal mush, thin and stretched, but warm and filling. The children ate in silence at first, shoveling food into hungry mouths with the desperation of the half-starved. Ezra sat near the window, sipping from a dented tin cup, pretending not to notice when one of the little ones pocketed an extra piece of bread for later. It went on like that for days. Ezra mended a broken fence, hauled wood, made trips to town for flour, beans, and soap. Each night, Mary and the children settled near the fire, speaking in low voices, sharing looks that said more than words could. And each night, Ezra took his bedroll to the corner, giving them space that wasn't really his to give, but felt like the least he could offer. It was on the fourth evening that something shifted. Ezra came back from town carrying a sack of potatoes over one shoulder. As he stepped onto the porch, he froze. There, near the edge of the clearing, stood Mary with a shotgun propped against her shoulder, the older boy beside her holding a rusty hatchet. Ezra followed their gaze and spotted the cause, a thin stranger in a tattered coat, lurking near the tree line, watching the cabin with too much interest. Without a word, Ezra stepped off the porch and strode toward the man. The stranger didn't wait. One look at Ezra's expression, and he vanished into the woods like a shadow chased by dawn. When Ezra returned, Mary lowered the shotgun but didn't let go of it. "Can't be too careful," she said quietly, her voice steadier than he'd yet heard it. Ezra gave a slow nod, a flicker of something like pride stirring in his chest. "No, ma'am," he said. "You surely can't." And for the first time since that morning at the depot, she almost smiled. The first frost came early that year, dusting the fields with silver and turning the air sharp enough to bite skin. Ezra spent the morning chopping wood, stacking it high against the cabin wall. Every swing of the axe split more than just timber. It cracked something open in him, something restless and heavy that had settled since the day he brought them all home. Inside, Mary moved with quiet purpose. She sewed patches onto the children's coats, stirred the pot over the fire, taught the youngest to shape bread dough with small, clumsy hands. The older boy, who Ezra had learned was named Eli, helped with chores without being asked. He carried water, checked snares, kept watch near the tree line where strangers might wander too close. Slowly, the house shifted from shelter to something closer to home. Not in words, not in declarations, but in small, unnoticed ways. One evening, as the wind pressed hard against the cabin walls, Ezra heard music for the first time in months. It was faint, no more than Mary humming a half-forgotten tune while she brushed her youngest daughter's hair by firelight. The sound stopped him mid-step, an ache blooming in his chest so sudden and sharp he had to grip the doorframe just to stay standing. They were healing, somehow, but peace in the West never lasted long. It happened on a gray afternoon when Ezra rode into Milbrook for supplies. Sheriff Doyle caught him outside the general store, one hand resting heavy on the butt of his revolver, his brow lined with something between warning and regret. "Frank Whitaker's back," the sheriff said without preamble. Ezra felt the words like a fist to the ribs. "Where?" Spotted south of town, Doyle answered. Drunk, loud, bragging about coming for what's his. Ezra's jaw clenched. What's he riding with? 2 men, strangers, mean-looking sort. The sheriff scratched his beard, voice low and tired. I can't stop him unless he makes trouble inside town lines. You know how it is. Ezra knew. The law out here had more holes than a screen door in summer. Without another word, Ezra swung into the saddle and rode hard for home, dust rising behind him like a warning bell. When he burst through the cabin door, the children jumped. Mary stood from her place by the hearth, reading the fear on his face before he spoke a word. Pack what you need, Ezra said, voice low, urgent. Now. Mary's hands moved fast, gathering blankets, food, anything portable. The children followed her lead, wide-eyed but silent, understanding without explanation that danger had found them again. Ezra loaded the rifle he kept above the door and laid 2 spare revolvers on the table. He showed Eli how to check the chamber, how to aim, how to brace his shoulders when firing. The boy's hands shook, but he nodded with grim resolve. Night fell fast, heavy with the scent of cold earth and distant rain. Ezra took first watch on the porch, eyes fixed on the dark horizon, waiting for a fight he hoped wouldn't come, but knew would. The night stretched long and tense, every creak of the cabin timbers sounding like footsteps, every gust of wind across the prairie raising the hairs on Ezra's neck. Inside, Mary kept the children close, sitting them in a tight circle near the hearth as if sheer proximity might shield them from what was coming. Ezra sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, watching the tree line for any flicker of movement. The stars hung cold and distant overhead, indifferent witnesses to the fear building inside that small house. Around midnight, footsteps finally broke the silence, slow, deliberate, crunching across frost-bitten grass. Ezra stood, lifting the rifle to his shoulder. Frank Whitaker emerged first, swagger in his step but with a mean edge in his eyes that no amount of whiskey could soften. Behind him 2 strangers followed, both armed, both wide-shouldered and grinning with the kind of cruelty that made Ezra's stomach turn. "Well now," Frank called out, voice thick with drink and arrogance. "Ain't this a cozy little setup you've got here, Blackwood?" Ezra didn't answer. His stance stayed steady, eyes locked on Frank's hands. Frank stepped closer, stopping just past the gate. "Come to collect what's mine," he said, gesturing toward the cabin door. "Wife, kids, you know how it is." Ezra's grip tightened on the rifle. "You sold 'em," Ezra said, voice low, cutting. "Took the money, left 'em for dead." Frank spat into the dirt. "Didn't mean it, was drunk. Times were hard, but I'm here now, ready to make things right." He grinned, yellow-toothed and shameless. "Or make a mess? Your choice." Inside, Mary stood behind the curtain, shotgun in hand, every muscle coiled like a wire about to snap. Eli crouched near the doorframe, hatchet in his trembling hands, staring at Ezra through the crack in the wood, waiting for a sign. Ezra's voice stayed calm, measured, almost quiet. "You got 3 seconds to turn around and leave this place." Frank laughed, a low, ugly sound. "And if I don't?" Ezra didn't answer with words. The crack of the rifle split the air like lightning tearing across dry sky. The shot struck the dirt inches from Frank's boots, sending up a spray of dust and frozen earth. Both hired men flinched, reaching for their own weapons, but Ezra already had the rifle leveled at the nearest one's chest. "Next one won't miss," Ezra said, voice cold as stone. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind kicked up, rattling the loose tin on the cabin roof. Then, with a curse and a stumble, Frank backed away, dragging his companions with him. Ezra didn't lower the rifle until all 3 disappeared into the darkness beyond the trees. Only then did he exhale, shoulders sagging, the adrenaline leaving him shaky and lightheaded. Inside, Mary sank to her knees, pulling her children close. Ezra stepped back into the cabin, bolted the door, and set the rifle against the wall. For a long time, he just stood there, watching the fire burn low, his heart still pounding like distant hoofbeats across an empty plain. The next morning dawned gray and brittle, the kind of sky that threatened snow but hadn't yet found the strength to let it fall. Ezra stepped outside before first light, surveying the perimeter, checking for any signs that Frank or his men had lingered nearby. But the ground was undisturbed. The only footprints leading away from the cabin were Ezra's own from the night before. Still, he didn't trust it. Inside, Mary moved about the room with quiet efficiency, gathering supplies, wrapping food in cloth, helping the children bundle into their coats. Her hands were steady, her jaw set. The fear from last night hadn't disappeared, but it had hardened into something else. Resolve. Ezra watched her from across the room as he loaded extra cartridges into his belt. There was a new weight to her presence now. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, anchored strength that hadn't been there when she first stepped into his life at that dusty depot. By mid-morning, Sheriff Doyle arrived, riding up with dust on his coat and lines of worry deep across his brow. "Heard there was trouble out here," the sheriff said, dismounting with a grunt. Ezra nodded, explaining what had happened. Short and plain, without embellishment. Doyle listened, chewing the inside of his cheek, his eyes drifting toward the cabin where Mary stood in the doorway, one hand resting protectively on the shoulder of her youngest child. "Frank's a bad piece of work," Doyle said finally. "But like I told you, law's thin out here. Unless he makes another move inside town, my hands are tied." Ezra looked him square in the eye. "So, untie him." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then sighed, scratching at his beard. "We got an opening for a deputy," he said slowly. "Not much pay, less thanks, but it'd give you the right to carry that badge, and a legal reason to put a stop to this if he comes back." Ezra didn't answer right away. The idea of becoming part of any official system sat uneasy in his gut. He'd spent too long drifting, avoiding entanglements, keeping his name clean by keeping it unknown. But when he glanced at Mary, at the fear she fought to keep off her face, at the children huddled near her skirts, the decision came easy. "I'll take it," he said, voice low but certain. Sheriff Doyle nodded once. "I'll have the paperwork ready by tomorrow." As the sheriff rode off, Ezra stood on the porch staring out over the prairie, the badge now burning a silent promise in his pocket. That night, as they sat by the fire, Mary broke the long stretch of silence between them. "Thank you," she said, barely more than a whisper. Ezra shifted in his chair, staring into the flames. "Don't thank me yet," he murmured. "This ain't over." But even as he said it, some part of him, a part he hadn't trusted in years, began to believe it might be. That maybe, just maybe, they had a fighting chance at something that looked like home. Winter settled hard and fast, blanketing the Nebraska plains in layers of ice and bitter wind. The cabin became their world, its 4 wooden walls holding in what little warmth they could manage, and what little hope they'd begun to build. Ezra spent most days on patrol, riding through town and along the outer farms with the star-shaped deputy badge pinned awkwardly to his coat. It felt strange, heavier than it looked. But with every long ride and quiet conversation with Sheriff Doyle, Ezra grew into the role, learning not just how to carry a gun for others, but how to carry their trust. At home, Mary kept the cabin alive with small acts of care. She taught the children to mend clothes, to bake bread, to set traps for rabbits when the cupboards grew bare. Eli became Ezra's shadow, following him through the woods, learning how to track, how to read the sky for signs of changing weather. There were moments, short, almost invisible, when laughter crept in, when the younger children built snowmen outside, their cheeks red from cold but their eyes bright. When Mary, without thinking, rested a hand on Ezra's arm as she passed him in the narrow space between table and hearth. When Ezra caught himself watching her as she braided her hair at night, the firelight catching strands of copper and gold, where before there had only been exhaustion and grief. But peace was a fragile thing. News came one afternoon, carried by a farm boy sent to town for grain. Frank Whitaker had been seen again, this time gathering more men, hired guns. Hard-faced strangers known for doing violence without questions. Ezra sat on the cabin steps that evening, cleaning his rifle with slow, deliberate movements. The horizon burned pink and gold, but all he felt was the tightening in his chest. Mary stepped outside, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the cold. "How long do we have?" she asked quietly. Ezra shook his head. "Days, maybe less." Silence settled between them, thick as the snow drifting in the air. Mary sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "We should run," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. They both knew it wouldn't matter. Men like Frank didn't stop chasing until there was no one left to chase. Ezra turned toward her, watching the way the light traced the curve of her face, the set of her jaw, the worry carved deep into the corners of her eyes. You and the kids. Take the wagon. Head south. I'll hold them off here. Mary's gaze snapped to his, sharp and burning. No! The word hung between them, simple and immovable. I won't leave this place. Not again. Not with them. She swallowed hard, fighting the tremble in her throat. We'll stay. We'll fight. Ezra's heart pulled tight, something fierce and aching rising up inside him. For a long moment they sat together in the falling dusk, two people stitched together by chance, by fear, by choice. And when he finally nodded, the gesture felt like a promise. The morning of the attack came with no warning, no trumpet of hoofbeats, no shouted threats across the prairie, just the sudden crack of gunfire splitting the cold air like a blade. Ezra had been near the barn, checking the horses, when the first shot rang out. Without hesitation, he sprinted for the cabin, heart pounding, legs burning. Bullets struck the wooden walls like angry fists. The children screamed, ducking low behind overturned furniture while Mary, her hands steady as iron, returned fire through the narrow gap beside the front door. Ezra dove through the entrance, rolling across the floor just as another shot splintered the doorframe above his head. He crawled to the table, grabbed his rifle, and positioned himself at the side window. Frank's men had spread out across the clearing, 4 of them now, crouched behind rocks and tree stumps, rifles raised. Frank himself stood farther back, shouting orders, drunk on hate and whiskey and years of bitterness. Ezra fired once, catching one of the gunmen in the shoulder. The man fell back, screaming. Another charged toward the house, only to be dropped by a shotgun blast from Mary that knocked him flat into the dirt. Inside, Eli crouched by the back door, hatchet gripped tight, his face pale but determined. The younger children huddled near the hearth, their eyes wide but tearless now, too shocked for crying. The fight stretched long and mean, each breath a gamble, each shot a negotiation with death. When Ezra's rifle ran dry, he grabbed his revolver and crawled toward Mary's side. Their shoulders touched briefly as they fought, two bodies moving with instinct, desperation, and the shared understanding that this was their stand, their line in the sand. But no matter how many men they dropped, Frank kept coming. His voice rose above the gunfire, taunting, slurring Mary's name, laughing like the devil himself. Ezra's muscles burned, his vision blurred from smoke and dust. But still he fought. When one of the gunmen broke through the back door, Ezra tackled him to the ground, driving the butt of his revolver into the man's skull with raw, final force. Then, suddenly, silence, a breathless, terrifying pause. Ezra crawled to the window, heart hammering. Frank stood alone now, his men either dead or fleeing into the trees. Blood stained his shirt, his pistol trembled in his unsteady hand, but his eyes, those wild, hateful eyes, stayed locked on the cabin. "You think this is over?" Frank roared, stumbling forward, raising his gun. "You think you've won?" Ezra leveled his revolver, hands steady despite the tremor running through his body. Frank took one more step, and Mary fired. The shot rang sharp and final, cutting through the cold like lightning through dry air. Frank staggered, dropped to his knees, then fell face first into the dirt, silent and still. Inside the cabin, no one moved at first. The children stared. Eli lowered his hatchet with shaking hands. Ezra turned toward Mary. Her shotgun slipped from her grasp, landing on the floor with a dull thud. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths, but her eyes stayed fixed on the door, waiting, unwilling to trust that it was really over. Ezra crossed the room, knelt beside her, and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It's done," he whispered. "It's done." For the first time since the depot, she let herself cry. Spring arrived late that year, as if the earth itself needed time to recover. The snows melted slow, turning the dirt roads to thick rivers of mud. But with the thaw came new life. Green shoots broke through frostbitten ground. Wildflowers returned to the edges of the fields. And for the first time in what felt like forever, laughter rose from the Blackwood farm without fear chasing close behind it. Ezra built a new addition onto the cabin, a second room with windows facing east, where the morning light poured in soft and gold. The children helped, hauling wood, hammering nails with small but determined hands. Eli grew taller by the month, his shoulders broadening, his voice deepening. The younger ones ran barefoot through the fields, their hair wild, their cheeks flushed with health and sun. Mary changed too. Her face, still marked by hard years, now carried something softer beneath the lines, something like peace. She smiled more, though never for show. Just small, honest moments when the weight in her chest lifted long enough to let light in. Ezra noticed every one of them. The day he proposed, there were no grand speeches, no flowers or ribbons, just two people standing side by side in the field where the corn would soon grow. He cleared his throat, turning the small silver ring over in his calloused palm before holding it out. "I don't have much," he said simply, "but what I have, it's yours, if you'll have it." Mary looked at him for a long moment, her eyes shining but steady. Then, with a quiet smile that reached deeper than any words, she nodded. They married under the wide Nebraska sky, with Sheriff Doyle serving as witness, and the children gathered close, forming a protective, joyful circle around them. No fancy dress, no grand procession, just vows spoken with hearts that meant them. Years passed, and the Blackwood farm became something of a landmark in Milbrook. People pointed it out when travelers passed through, telling the story of the $15 family, the woman and her children bought like livestock, the quiet man who couldn't walk away, and the life they built from ruin and choice. On summer evenings, when the air turned gold and the fields hummed with crickets, Ezra and Mary sat on the porch, side by side in worn wooden chairs. Sometimes they spoke of that day at the depot, how chance and desperation had collided to shape the rest of their lives. Other times they sat in silence, listening to the laughter of grandchildren playing under the same trees that had once sheltered fear. Ezra would reach for Mary's hand, her fingers fitting perfectly between his, and they'd watch the sun sink low over the prairie, grateful at last for the simple, quiet miracle of belonging. And as twilight settled, with fireflies blinking in the grass and distant stars beginning their slow silver dance, one truth remained, etched in memory, in soil, in every nail and beam of that home. Family wasn't something you were given. It was something you chose. And sometimes it only cost $15 and a little bit of courage.